Our first post-mortem of 2023. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? What won? What lost? That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter, bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, we like to do a lot of the macro discussions. Obviously, anyone who listens to us in draft season and in the off season knows that we spend a lot of time talking about structural drafting, positional trends, pockets of value, areas to avoid, how to go about different things. People will know that our big strategy this year did involve attacking the running back dead zone a little bit with a specific group of backs that got hit hard early, immediately. J.K. Dobbins going down and missing the whole season was one of the key names in that group. But that structure of building strong elite receiver depth in the first couple of rounds, then coming back to running back, then going back to receiver, potentially getting an elite quarterback, an elite tight end in there, being willing to use those rounds 3 to 6 range that in the past have often been wide receiver pick no-brainers. We felt like could be all non-wide receiver picks if you started wide receiver in the first 2 rounds, which was the real key for us. That was where we landed. Obviously, we talk about these things a lot all off season. And it's fun when the season comes in to then talk about what actually worked and why it worked and what we think will work in the future and what it means. One of the biggest things that we always talk about with this, Shawn, is every season is its own data point. It's one individual data. I just mentioned the J.K. Dobbins thing, and we had very few running backs that we were targeting in that range. If all of them had gone down, that strategy would have been completely lost, right? The different pockets of player value. I just mentioned the early receiver stuff. We'll get to this. That has been very successful. A big part of the reason that's been so successful is most of the early running backs have failed. That's not necessarily something that we were sure would happen. We've acknowledged before the early running backs do have plenty of upside. Christian McCaffrey, if you go look at it, essentially the only one in the top 8 or 9 that you would have wanted to have over a list of 8 receivers that were going in that range. And so those different outcomes, the different areas of the draft at different positions dramatically impact the way that we then talk about what won over that individual season. But you have to be willing and able and functional enough analytically to acknowledge that it could have went a different way. There could have been different outcomes. And what about 2023 is actually signal for future drafting? What about it was noise? How is the market going to react that will then change some of the trends? Obviously, in the past, the running back dead zone looked like a huge trend, and the market reacted, and then we ended up pivoting back in 2023. All of those are very important things to think about as we start the process of unpacking the 2023 season.
It is, and it's a fun week now to look through that. One of the things that we're going to do is evaluate our own teams a little bit, see where they are and where we're hoping that they can go. Talk about, obviously, what we did right. Talk about what we did wrong or would like to do differently. Some of what you did wrong is this question of, were you unlucky or were you wrong? And how critical do you want to be? How accurate can you be in your self-evaluation? Because if the self-evaluation ends up being inaccurate, then you don't make the right tweaks. And that can work either way. I think that some people are going to say, I'm going to immediately think about self-evaluation and about not being critical enough, but it's equally problematic if you're too critical or just, again, are simply wrong in understanding what things you probably had right from a structural and player evaluation perspective and maybe got unlucky and those things were mitigated, and then which things you probably should have evaluated differently and or just drafted differently to put the things together. One of the things that you mentioned to me before the show that I thought was pretty interesting was this element of fading players. And that immediately got me to think about the guys that were, more or less on my do not draft list. And it's always tricky because in some ways the do not draft list is a little bit, less upside for an analyst than the player targets list, because if you're fading players and they really do go off, then
it looks bad.
There's an element here where simply missing on some of your hits doesn't hurt you as much as telling people to really avoid someone who becomes a star. But when you're looking through this and you're looking through,
and then also
categories,
when you hit your fade, it doesn't win anyone a league. It's just you didn't draft somebody. I mean, no one's like, yeah, I won my league because I didn't draft that guy you told me not to draft. That's not. I mean, that doesn't work.
Yeah, usually. I mean, there are going to be some cases where people will be like, I didn't draft Calvin Ridley. I didn't draft Darren Waller. And that really did help me. But mostly, like you're saying, it's just going to be a thing of when Amari Cooper is having his normal bland year, people will think it doesn't make that much difference either way. And you can even argue that where he was, that maybe not even that bad of a pick. But when we're looking through the profiles of must draft, draft when the player falls, draft in an emergency, and fade, which are more or less the categories that I use from my own board, and then you're working through those. I mean, obviously that's the ADP is factored in there, but you're also trying to figure out how you can make your rankings work in a way that allows you the most total value. You're not always picking your highest ranked player first because you know how other managers are using the draft board. Those things become pretty interesting. But that's sort of a long-winded way of saying the thing that jumps out to me is that the veteran fades and the veteran targets, I feel, were very good in 2023. The breakout targets were weak.
They've been bad, yeah.
And I think that sometimes people are going to look at that and say, well, if your veteran analysis was very good this year, and I would want to say too that most of the time, my ability to exploit veterans is not as strong as my ability to exploit unproven players. And unproven players are the players who give you the really wide range of outcomes, and you can beat the draft by many rounds. Now, there were some guys we thought were going to beat by a lot this year, like a Keenan Allen, for example. You could throw a Mike Evans into that category. But generally speaking, where you're going to have your biggest advantage is with the young players. But the other thing that I would say there, Ben, that is kind of interesting, at least for me, is that anytime you say, well, I want to take less risk because I am good at evaluating the veterans, then you go back and look at what actually won for you. And I mean, I think for us, the answer is basically Sam Laporta.
Yeah.
And so if you take some of the misses and say, I'm going to be more conservative, then in the following season, you don't have the guy who was the most important. I was sort of joking in my Zero RB Universe article this week that our three teams, so you have a couple of additional teams with the ship chasing group. You've got a separate team beyond that. Your teams are doing extremely well. Two of our three teams won. I have an additional team that I'm doing with Colin Kelly. It won. It was really exciting for me to go 3-1 last week. I know that you, I think, basically did that double. Very exciting. The three teams that I have that advanced all have Sam Laporta. And then I was joking that they all have Jackson Smith and Jigba, so he must have also been a league winner, right? You can have some of those misses if you have the huge hits. And most of the time, that player who both scores enough and you can add to enough teams, because Sam Laporta is somebody that we had on virtually every main event team. And you look at that and say, if Sam Laporta gets hurt, that's kind of your point at the beginning. If Sam Laporta gets hurt, then the season looks very different.
Yep.
Right. But also, if you just randomly select a bunch of tight ends to protect yourself, the season looks different. I mean, the second most important guy in many cases for us is Trey McBride, who is an interesting case because not all of those teams are teams that drafted him originally. Some of the teams are teams that drafted him originally, cut him, and then made a big bid to get him back because as soon as it looked like he might play, then you're right back to that original thesis. But my point is here that, and think through to things like the best ball too, where I look at my exposures, and on approximately 85 teams, I have 34% Sam Laporta, which is a huge part of why things are going well. If you try to avoid that or try and say, let's take less risk, let's not draft a Jackson Smith and Jigba. I mean, Ben, it didn't happen. And I don't think that you can look at this year's team and say that it was close to happening. And yet a player with a similar profile to JSN on a similar type of team, for that player with that team situation and that prospect profile coming in to go off in a way at wide receiver that was similar to what Laporta has done at the tight end position, I would say that's extremely likely. That's not something I would want to fade the next year. So I mentioned a couple points there in terms of I think, relatively good success we had with veterans in 2023. And then this sort of interesting dynamic of relatively weak breakout hit percentage, but huge leverage on the hits that you do get. How are you thinking about those things as they interlock or as they work to create this overall draft environment?
Well, the first thing, I mean, you said a ton of great stuff. The first thing I loved was the Laporta point. I do feel like tight end has been so important this year. And again, that gets back to the discussion of it is a position that's always important because there's not a ton of options. And, you know, Kyle Pitts didn't hit this year. George Kittle has been good and had some explosive games, but that team just has so many weapons that it's difficult. Kelsey and Hawkinson at the top have been good, but Kelsey hasn't been as good. Andrews gets hurt. Didn't have a great year before that. Waller, similar. I mean, was worse and then also got hurt. Goddard got hurt. Freiermuth got hurt. That's the top 8 tight ends. I think I just named all of them. And not an overwhelming smash in the top. And then in the late rounds, there's some other names like a Jake Ferguson or, early season Hunter Henry, but really didn't do anything. Seeing similar point with Trey McBride where like it took him a while, but now he's coming on and is so massive. I mean, significantly better when you talk about what McBride's doing lately and what we expect him to do the rest of the way. But some late round tight ends, and to your point, if you were on the right ones, when I look at like my best ball portfolio, it's similar to what you described with Laporta. The teams that are doing well are the ones that have good tight ends, and like almost universally. And then the ones that when I start looking at my bubble teams, I'm like, oh, here's a really good bubble team. One of the things I got wrong that I mentioned to you is I was not as on Devon Achane as a lot of you guys. I'm really hoping that one of our when I say a lot of you guys, I mean you. I mean the ship chasing guys. I feel like a lot of people that I play with and talk to were more interested in him than I was. Had some size concerns. Obviously, that has been ridiculous. Well, I mean, I don't know. We could look at that a lot of different ways. He did end up getting banged up, so you could look at that some different ways. But one team that I found that I have him in. I was talking to you because we have him on one of our co-managed main event teams that needs to win this week to get to the sprint, and I'm really, really hoping that we do because I want an Achane team through. That would be my only, I think, Achane team that I would have real exposure to because I don't have a lot of best ball. I have a decent hit rate or advance rate right now in best ball, but I don't have a lot of Achane. One team I did find that has Achane is on this bubble. Was one that didn't have the tight ends and all those things. And so it's doing pretty well, but it kind of has some fatal flaws. And so you find these teams that are like, man, there's some good players here. This is looking good. Or has like a really good set of receivers. Man, I really hit the perfect receivers here. And then I go down to the bottom and I'm like, oh, this is a Greg Dulcich, whatever team. And like, that's why this team's on the bubble as opposed to these other teams I'm looking at that aren't that strong, but are leading their divisions because they have Laporta and, they were like a Laporta Henry build or a Laporta Ferguson build or something. It's like, yeah, I mean, this team just crushed in tight end points all year. And that was a huge factor for it. And that carries over from best ball to season long. I think it's a great point that Laporta really was one of the keys to this entire season. The second thing I wanted to mention was your commentary about the young players and the young breakouts not hitting, in addition to your commentary at the beginning of your last statement that was we need to be honest about the things that we got right and we didn't get right, and that self-evaluation is so important. And one of the things that I've tried to talk through over the years, maybe not done perfectly, but I believe very strongly is a very important point to make here as it relates to these interlocking points is I like a bias. I'm sure there's some, it's so funny that psychological biases, the cognitive biases we talk about, there's names for them and you go read them. And I've spent a lot of time on like Wikipedia reading about these. And really it just comes down to like, these are things that describe behavior and we can, experience them all on ourselves. And then they have names that are given to them. The one I'm about to describe probably doesn't have a name because it's very specific to fantasy football. So I don't know that we would be able, that maybe somebody could tell me a bias, one of our listeners that this would apply to. There's like hundreds.
Everybody
so
chime
I don't know
in with the actual name of this for Ben, and then separately chime in with what you think the name should be.
Yeah,
and we'll see.
We need someone to name it.
See what the best answers are here.
Yeah, we need someone to name it. But it's sort of a youth bias, right? Where that's what I was going to call it, where when we miss on the young players, it feels more like a condemnation of our analytical and evaluative abilities, where we weren't able to see that this player wasn't actually good because that player had not yet shown it. And we were trying to predict something to happen the first time. And this, I think, Shawn, is less of an issue maybe for us, you and I, and people who draft a lot of youth players, but I see it often in the fantasy football space where people will just write off when a veteran doesn't produce to the level that they had over multiple years. But we talk a lot about the chaos in the NFL, how hard it is to continue to produce at the same level over and over and over again, how you can't just project the season based on last year's numbers. You can't just say, hey, Derrick Henry's been this guy over the last 4 years. He's going to be it again this 5th year. It's every year he does it, it's increasingly less likely that he can continue to be the same player. And I use Derrick Henry in part because I'm looking at a draft board to get some ideas of player names, and he popped up. But I also think he's a great point because he didn't have a terrible year this year. He has been more of a slow decline, right? He's stayed healthy. He's gotten a lot of volume, but he's not the same Derrick Henry as the one that was massive a couple of years ago and hitting on 60-yard TD runs all the time. You can't just expect players to be the same thing they were in the past. And yet, when they're not, a lot of people write it off as that's not something we could have known. I drafted Travis Kelce this year because he's been Travis Kelce every year. And Travis Kelce's been great again this year and still should be considered the tight end 1 right now. But if you look at his production over the last 4 or 5 weeks, you're like, man, this is not Travis Kelce of 2022, right? And there was some risk there with that. And so when veterans, those are not the perfect examples because both of those guys have scored some points, but you start to talk about the obvious like fall off guys. The big one from last year was Ezekiel Elliott, where his last year in Dallas, he was still getting drafted in like the 4th round. And then he was just not the same player, nowhere near the same player. And it was so obvious. And I think people are so quick. I see a lot of like mocking of drafting youth upside. Like, oh, you guys thought Sky Moore was good. Like last year. Oh, you thought Sky Moore was going to be the superstar. And it's the same people that were drafting Ezekiel Elliott, and they'll never acknowledge that, Ezekiel Elliott also had a bad year because for them, they had seen it. They'd seen Ezekiel Elliott be consistently good 4 or 5 years in a row. So when he has the bad year and he's the miss, it's not on them. It's on Ezekiel Elliott for not continuing to produce in the same way. But when you try to predict a young player, then it's on you as an evaluator. You thought this guy was good. You guys thought Quentin Johnson was good this year? I mean, what are you thinking? Like, how this guy can't catch? Didn't you watch his tape? This guy is terrible at football.
The other element that really comes into play here as well is understanding how you can create an overall team that maximizes the upside. Because Ben, right now I have one of our teams pulled up that is directly into the tournament. It was the one team that did lose this last week. So it's nice that it's directly into the race. Although, in many ways, it's more important to win your league than to worry about the race because the race is going to have a lot of good teams in it. Your chances to win that not great, even if you have multiple good teams in. Ben, this team, again, that finished in the top 2 and is directly in, I think must have finished with the most points. Treylon Burks, Quentin Johnston, Rashad Bateman, the picks in rounds 8, 9, and 10. And you look at that and say, well, that team must have done poorly. When the reality is that team was structured in a way that if any of those picks hit, then you have additional upside. But when they miss, you're still okay.
Yeah, I mean, and then the only other receiver we took after that was Jamison Williams, who also hasn't been particularly great. This is one of the teams where we really hit the running back dead zone hard, took 4 backs, and spent a lot of time flexing running backs this year. But it was a strong team after a wide receiver start, structurally very similar to our other teams. But that whole point I wanted to make about the youth and about those targets, and Shawn, that's a great additional point about the types of misses that accepting those types of misses is part of what also leads to the hits, the Sam Laporta hit. And you mentioned that JSN could have been that type of hit. You don't want to be betting against that. But the key thing that I was trying to drive home really is this idea that you said, which is so strong, that we need to be honest in our reflection of ourselves. Like in any time I'm doing any kind of analysis, I'm trying to think about the ways that my stupid peanut brain are affected by psychological biases that we can't control. And it's really important. I think the only way to be a good analyst in anything is to you can't really set your biases aside is the whole point, right? Is to understand that you are biased as an analyst and how you are biased and try your best to view things in an unbiased fashion. But when you can't, to acknowledge, yeah, I'm biased. But like I'll always be biased by like favorably for certain players and negatively against others. That's just because of, I don't know, my initial analyses on them, the ways that I saw people react to their early successes, whatever the reasons are. But there are biases that exist in me and it exists in all of us. And for us to get better when we analyze the results of a season, like everyone in fantasy loves to, this is a really popular topic right now as we head towards the playoffs. To get better in our analysis, your point is so strong that we have to be honest. And I just want to make that one point because I've talked to a lot of people over the years that we've done this, Shawn, that try to be a little bit more youth-friendly. And a few years back, it was to try to be a little bit more zero RB. They didn't really commit all the way, though. And then they weren't successful necessarily. And then they blamed that for why they weren't successful. And I've seen that dichotomy of what I brought up last year's examples of Sky Moore and Ezekiel Elliott, where there's more blame placed on the Sky. Like there will be more blame for a lot of people placed on the Quentin Johnston picks when they look at their draft than on the veterans that were not productive or got hurt or what hurt. If an older player gets hurt, it just feels like bad luck, despite the fact that we know that, certainly injuries do occur for older players at a little bit of a higher rate. And there are it's an important element.
For me too, I look at that string of 3 straight picks there in the Treylon Burks, Quentin Johnston, Rashad Bateman picks. The one that I look back on and think preseason was a good selection was actually Quentin Johnston. I have a lot more problem with having taken Treylon Burks and especially Rashad Bateman than I do Quentin Johnston, where Johnston, I think, was a result of, that's a very wide range of outcomes pick that you're making. And I would take that profile in that situation again 100% of the time. The JSN and the Quentin Johnston picks I really like. The Treylon Burks and Rashad Bateman picks I really hate. And there are reasons that we'll kind of get into as we go, deeper into the offseason of why those specific picks I think were objectively mistakes when we made them. And so again, that's kind of this thing of when we look back, what do we think were mistakes? What do we think were bad luck? And then it goes to this question that you're kind of dealing with right now of like, how accurate are we with that? Because there's a possibility that the Treylon Burks and Rashad Bateman picks were good picks and we got unlucky. And the Quentin Johnston pick is a bad pick. I don't think that that's true, but that's the thing you have to figure out is whether or not the evidence, the history, the logic, the structure, all of those things wrapped together, you've got to evaluate them, not in a vacuum, but you've got to evaluate them as they work together and figure out, again, like which picks were the actual bad picks. Would you agree with that there in those 3 guys where, of the 3 picks, if you had one back, which one would you want back? Obviously we would want all of them back. I would agree. I don't know if I would put them into such strong buckets apart from each other, but I
the way that you ranked them, Quentin Johnson being the most forgivable pick. And to your point, he was a really wide range of outcomes player that we literally talked about this offseason being a potential very low floor, but also high ceiling player. I mean, that was part of the known range of outcomes with him, even when the Chargers made the pick. And everyone has been running laps around the Chargers, showing that they took him over Jordan Addison and where they drafted him in the NFL draft. But even at that time, it was very clear. And there were a lot of people that said, hey, this is a low floor pick, but he also has a ton of ceiling with his size and speed and profile. If he can really get it all together, you have a legitimate elite wide receiver one for Justin Herbert for the next several years, in a way that like the other players maybe felt like higher floor, but potentially lower ceiling, not as like physically imposing and maybe not as dominant if they hit in the ways that they would hit. And I think everyone sort of knew that about the Chargers from the moment he was selected, and we knew it in the whole offseason. And so then when this happens, you can't double count, I mean, that's essentially what it becomes, is like, that's part of the range. Like, you have to accept that like good positive outcomes happen and negative outcomes happen. That's what a range of outcomes is. And you have to be willing, again, with this idea of analytical honesty and in hindsight, with knowing the results, you have to be willing from a process perspective to recognize that. I agree that Quentin Johnson is the one that I least would care about our decision to have selected him or would want back. Treylon Burks, to me, still one that I was pretty comfortable with, other than the team situational stuff was very concerning. But from a player profile, I'm actually pretty curious what your thoughts are on that. Bateman having it, him going into his third year and having had some issues, really, and having a tough rookie year, and then really just basing it off of a very small sample in his second year where he was better, and hoping that was going to, shine through, and the prospect profile was going to shine through. Again, similar to Sky Moore as well, where you're kind of hoping some of the prospect stuff does shine through, but we'd gotten some pretty bad evidence at the NFL level already. Those are guys that I do think in hindsight you can say weren't, aggressive enough picks. They would have had to really turn things around to hit in a way that, that's the way that I would rank those. But I am curious to hear.
Is that after you get by Rashad Bateman, you're basically looking at Houston Texans players and Puka as the only relevant receivers. So things have dried up to a massive extent when you're looking at Rashad Bateman already being the wide receiver 51. I mentioned that I feel pretty comfortable with that Quentin Johnston pick and would want to make the same style of pick again in 2024. To give a little bit of a sense of that, the wide receivers selected immediately ahead of him were Juju Smith-Schuster, who was someone that we had as like the very strongest do not select you could possibly ever get to. Romeo Dobbs, an interesting player. Elijah Moore, probably an interesting player, but Kadarius Toney, Michael Thomas, Gabe Davis. I mean, these are weaker selections than Quentin Johnson, and those guys are already gone. And so it's interesting there, and it gets back, I think, to the overall structural picture for 2023. You let off at the top with this idea that the first couple of rounds, certainly through pick 14 or 15, that you needed to get that right to be successful in 2023. And so we're looking at things we did right, things we did wrong, putting them into a couple of buckets there. I do think that one of the strongest things that we got right was the first 15 picks. And the way that I'm looking at that is that Christian McCaffrey was a strong target. And you say that's pretty straightforward. And it is in many ways. But Christian McCaffrey as a strong target and every other running back as more or less a fade. Now we do have some Bijan, but every other running back as more or less a fade. And Amon-Ra St. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, and Garrett Wilson as must draft players in that 108 to like 14 overall to 202, 203 range. It may sound a little bit strange to include Garrett Wilson. He's actually had a viable season, or a bad season for the pick, but like the best possible season, a season that very much supports the talent thesis,
Right.
even with the problems that you had. And that is one of the things that you want, right? You can't control the injuries, but you would like to have a receiver who's so talented that even with the backup QB, you're going to be able to score some points and keep starting him. And I do think that he hit on that. But Ben, to have a lot of Christian McCaffrey, because he wasn't the 101 this year, and you could get him in a variety of different spots. To have a lot of Christian McCaffrey, and then to not have the other running backs and have a lot of Amon-Ra St. Brown and CeeDee Lamb, I think that those two things were absolutely crucial to have success, and we see that from our teams that are making it through.
Yeah, I got asked in the Signals Gold Q&A this week, how my teams were doing, and this is part of why we decided to go with this topic today, Shawn. It was a great question. How my teams are doing, and for the ones that are doing well, what went well. For the ones that are doing poorly, what went poorly. And one of the keys, you mentioned this earlier, and I'm very grateful and I'm happy to report that my portfolio is doing very, very well this year. One of the keys when I look at it, and I've looked at all these teams a ton, obviously. One of the things I would say to answer that question is, for the ones that didn't do well, for the ones that are out of it, it's certainly not structural, right? It was it was hitting on too many of the wrong players. But for the ones that were right, I think it was structural. I think the things that we talked about, Shawn, and I mentioned this at the top, but we started to really hammer the wide receiver start this year big time. I mean, I know I wrote the piece for the newsletter subscribers I think somewhat early in August, that a wide receiver start was your key in home leagues, what I think was the title. And then we spent most of the next month talking about how it was also the key in high stakes and everything else too. I mean, wherever you were playing, it was probably the key. And so, I mean, even the way that you just described, I didn't have McCaffrey as as strong of a pick as you did. And I didn't have the other early running backs like individually as strong of fades. I know I was a little higher than you on Austin Eckler, which has not panned out. I was a little gun shy on Bijan. I was mildly interested in a few of the other earlier running backs, though. But the key was structurally.
And I want to point out really quickly, and I know this is just like a horrible breaking your concentration for something that is random and not that interesting. But I did want to report, while we're on this topic, that our Bijan Robinson auto draft, where I was trying to make the selection on the long screen, that team is first place and running away. It's gapped by like hundreds of points. It's got like 5 RB1s on it.
Wow.
And if we had selected CeeDee Lamb, who I believe was the pick
I think
we were going to make, it would be gapped by even more points, and it would be a great contender for like the $3 million. But because we auto-picked Bijan Robinson, we now have running back points every week that we can't start in wide receivers that are 2 weeks. So you have me.
And we knew that. We knew that. Yeah, we knew that at the end of the draft. We knew that was. We were like, man, if we could just undo that pick, this is a really good team. We've closed. I'm almost certain we have this on a podcast, and we closed that podcast by pretty much saying, I think you closed it by saying, if this team ends up winning without that pick, if it comes down to that pick, it's going to be pretty tough. We're going to have to go back and listen to that, because that was a great aside. But anyway, for me personally, I was talking about I didn't necessarily have as strong of leans on those running backs, but I did feel very confident about the receivers in those ranges being the right targets, and the wide receiver structure, because then you could come back with running backs that I was as comfortable with, comparable profiles to the ones that I was comfortable with in the second round, but you could get them in the 4th round, in the 5th round. And so structurally, it made a lot of sense to take your early receivers. I spent a lot of time arguing about how the actual elite, top 15 receivers do provide an advantage over those dead zone receivers, and especially this year that it was weak at receiver in the 4th and 5th rounds in a way that it typically is not. And that has, bared out. If you look at, I'm looking at that range right now, not a lot of hits. I mean, Brandon Ayuk was one that I do have some exposure to, but he has been basically the only guy in that group of the group I'm looking at right now: Christian Watson, Deontay Johnson, Drake London, DeAndre Hopkins, Amari Cooper, Mike Williams, Jahan Dotson, Brandon Ayuk. That's this one draft. That's a stretch of 8 receivers. McLaurin and Godwin are the 2 after that. I mean, none of those guys were good other than Brandon Ayuk, and that was the range where we were taking a lot of running backs. We had to take some tight ends. We took some quarterbacks in that range. But that structure, I think, was certainly a key. And I do feel comfortable in a sort of a self-evaluative sense being, doing like a pat on the back on that and being very, sort of proud that we got to that, because first of all, it was a deviation from a lot of the things that we've talked about over the last few years, especially in the dead zone, based on market factors and based on this year and what it was offering us, while also understanding, some of the advantages, the things that we've talked about do provide, including the early receivers. Because a big part of, the whole zero RB over the years has been really that you're willing to take receivers in the first couple rounds and then continue to hit receivers. Because a lot of people have done sort of the anchor running backs and then come back to receivers. The dead zone stuff was, compatible with basically any type of draft structure. So anyway, the advantages that the early receivers can provide, it's something that I remember you emphasizing for, multiple years in 2018, 2019, some of these early years when we were talking so much, where, it's not just the number of receivers, and it's not just that there's a wide receiver window or a break in a wide receiver or any of that stuff. There is also, the subtle movement from those really elite receivers that you can get in the first 2 rounds to then the 3rd, 4th, 5th round receivers. We haven't seen that as much in these last few years. We didn't see that in the Cooper Kupp breakout year, and the Jamar Chase and Deebo Samuel all had great years, and the top receivers weren't great that season. And yet you have to remember that can exist still. And we went back to it here in 2023, understood, look, this could be a year. It looks like it's going to be a year where you really want to have those early receivers and not be taking the 4th and 5th round receivers and thinking that there's not a gap there, because there is a gap. And so all of that stuff structurally, as I look back on this season and I think about why some of these teams are doing well and some of them are not doing well, again, the structural stuff I think was really on point. I'm proud of. I think that's why the good teams are doing well in large part. And even despite, as you talked about, when we came back to receiver late, we didn't hit on those breakout young guys. Why did our team still win? Well, we had the 2 anchor receivers, and we were able to still backfill. We added Puka Nacua in a lot of these leagues. We talked about that. We were aggressive early. You have the 2 anchor receivers. You add Puka Nacua, you wind up fine, even though you missed a lot of your 8, 9, 10 receivers. And so structurally, that stuff I think was a positive for those teams, and then also not really a negative for why the teams that lost. You just go look at those and you go, yeah, they look a lot like the drafts on the teams that were good, but sometimes this is why we draft a lot of teams when we dig into it as much as you and I do. Sometimes you miss on the players. Sometimes you run into too many injuries and things just don't pan out. So anyway, the structural stuff I think is a really important key, at least from how we approached it. Everyone is going to have their own approach and how they were, analyzing things and looking at it and then evaluating. As far as I'm concerned, the way that I wanted to approach drafts and tried to communicate it, and then the way that things panned out and the way my teams look as a result of that, I feel, very content with and confident in.
It's been a lot of fun too. And being able to pivot off of zero RB this year and have it be the right choice, I think in a lot of ways for me was a relief. And it does, I think, demonstrate that, at no point was that something that was dogmatic. The idea is to figure out how to win in the given year. And it wasn't the way to win this year necessarily. Now, the one that I think is kind of interesting here, and it is, vaguely player specific, but we were really high on Keenan Allen early. And you mentioned having a really high exposure to him in best ball. And I think that that's awesome. My exposure in best ball also is good. It has been neutralized in some cases where Jerry Jeudy is the bring back because that is,
we love that.
Yeah, a pretty disastrous pick. But in the main events, he had started to sneak up to a point where, and this is something I think is an interesting question. is once you've given back a lot of the value, do you still go after the player? Because one of the things that's fun about Keenan Allen is not only was he a great value when he was in the middle of round 4, but he's now had such a massive season that he would have been a good value in that, Devontae Smith, Calvin Ridley, T. Higgins type of range. And I look at some of the teams, and I look at the Chasing Stolen Bananas team, for example, and if you swap Keenan Allen and T. Higgins on that squad, then suddenly that team goes from being a good team and a team that is live this week to win a league. It goes into a team where you're suddenly looking at it as potentially a $3 million team. And so that's an interesting one of allowing, for me personally, of allowing an ADP. And if you've got a lot of exposure at a really good price, do you continue to get exposure at a worse price when you're also trying to get some exposure to someone like a T. Higgins who's falling and is getting to a better price? Now, again, a lot of this is just going to be in hindsight. You would prefer Keenan Allen because he's been a monster, and T. Higgins has been injured throughout the course of the season and now has his quarterback injured. So the injury element plays such a big role. I look at my team with Keenan Allen that I do have in the main event. Not surprisingly, that's a J.K. Dobbins team, so that hurts it. And then it's the one team that I don't have an impact tight end. I believe it was the first team out in its league. So this was one where you have the Keenan Allen pick. It was one where I desperately wanted to get it in because it was an H-An team. And so if you get the Keenan Allen with H-An, you get it through, you can do some exciting things. But for me, you have this question of, how are you managing a veteran as he rises when you're looking at your exposures? And then, again, we see that element where if you didn't have the tight end, it didn't matter as much what you did right otherwise, especially if you had a pick like the J.K. Dobbins. I mean, look at the teams that advanced and didn't advance. One of the things we talked about right after it happened was that you could still get some of these teams in. And I do have plenty of BBM Dobbins teams that are still in. I mean, obviously that's not going to help you at all, but just you can still get through if you make strong enough picks overall, because some injuries are baked in. You just hope it's not to the guy that you had. I mean, I had Dobbins as the number 1 overall value and ETN as the number 2 overall value. ETN has been good. It's been frustrating to see his usage. I think that, if he played for a team like the Miami Dolphins, we'd be talking about HN as, the overall RB1 outscoring Christian McCaffrey. So you hope not to have that injury, but some injuries are baked in. You're going to lose some of those guys, but you can't lose them and not have that tight end. The other thing, just to throw one other little piece into the mix here, Ben, this team that we've been discussing here is actually also a Kyle Pitts team. So in addition to missing on those young wide receivers, we miss on the elite tight end. For me, one of the things that was a huge part of Best Ball was this idea of you want to get to the 3, if not the 4 tight ends. Now, Best Ball and redrafts have some very different dynamics, but one of the things that we did late in this draft was, even though we selected Kyle Pitts, we also picked Hunter Henry, Michael Mayer, and Trey McBride. And obviously 2 of those guys also busted. But when you're talking about these late round picks and the leverage that they can provide for you and the profiles, because a Mayer is sort of like a discount version of Laporta, and it didn't work out. But there, again, is a universe out there. I'm not saying even necessarily Mayer specifically, but that profile at that price where he's the guy that everybody is talking about as the one player you had to have. So I'm still very happy that the original redraft exposure to him is very high. If you hit, you win big. If you miss, you move on. But then also coming back and selecting McBride. So this team is in it despite the Kyle Pitts selection, because Trey McBride has been that impact player for us. So the double, triple, and quadruple dipping at tight end to make sure that in one way, shape, or form, you had the impact tight end points. That for me structurally is the key. And then the individual players obviously make it work.
Yep. And I think a really funny thing comes to pass here, because a lot of people, another big part of this is we're looking for quick answers often when we start to think about why our team did well, why our team didn't do well. And one of the reasons, Shawn, that we do this and we talk to each other for as many hours as we do a year on these podcasts, and we write about this hobby as much as we do, and this entire industry has so many opinions, is that this is a really complex game. There are no easy answers. There's a lot of layers. There are so many things. Like I just went into like a freaking 5-minute soliloquy about how the first 2 round receivers are different than the 3rd, 4th, 5th round receivers, and how that used to be like something that, you would emphasize so many years ago, and it wasn't necessarily as true in the Cooper Cup year, and then it was again here in 2023, and it's something that we pulled back into as part of our draft strategy this year, was that those guys were going to be the picks in the first 2 rounds, the receivers, instead of these running backs. That opened up so much other stuff. One of the things when you talk about Laporta and Mayer that I think will be an immediate response for some people was, well, with Laporta, we knew he was going to play every snap right away. They told us. They held him out of the preseason. That was clear. Laporta was going to play immediately, and that if we want to go after these different, and that's why his price rose as well late. If we want to go after these different profiles, maybe we need to think about early opportunity and what's actually there, and go back to the projections game. And there might be a little bit of truth to that. With Mayer, the concern was, obviously you have Davante Adams there, in addition to they have Austin Hooper there and some other issues, overlapping target issues with both Jacoby Myers and Hunter Renfrow. It seemed hard to navigate Michael Mayer into a really important role there. But then the third player that you mentioned is Trey McBride, and you could have made the same case with Trey McBride, right? But that was the point. That was the point with McBride, and why he went so late was that Zach Ertz was still there, and we just watched this in 2022. We just watched Zach Ertz keep Trey McBride off the field the entire year, and going into the year, it was pretty clear that Arizona was going to use Zach Ertz a lot, and Trey McBride was not going to get on the field enough. Were they going to use 2 tight end sets? Oh, I don't know. We don't really know if McBride's going to be able. And so the main point I'm trying to drive home is, if you find yourself with the major takeaway between Laporta and Mayer being projected volume and projected usage early, I would point you towards McBride, where, I mean, one of the other biases with a guy like Mayer is like, well, we should have known that he was not going to be able to get to this role. But McBride, what played out was the upside thing that we were talking about. Maybe the team eventually just decides McBride's better than Ertz, and they did. It did take a little bit of an Ertz injury potentially, but McBride's been good enough that when Ertz got healthy, the team said, we're going to release you and allow you to go sign for another team, specifically because we want Trey McBride to be able to play every snap the rest of the way. They mentioned that. They said they wanted to let McBride be the guy the rest of the way and do right by Zach Ertz. But that transition and that flip that happened in season in 2023 was that upside case when we talk about, ways that it might play out. And also we talk about how there can just be chaos sometimes, right? And you can't necessarily predict it. And so you want to have the right types of profiles in place that when the chaos works in their favor, they can take advantage. All of those things were true here in the McBride outcome. They're less true in the Mayer outcome. So I would just point to, not overstating too much what we knew about the roles and things. Because I still think for Mayer, as you were talking through that, there is a world where he winds up that player. I think one of the keys is, a world where Davante Adams isn't the number one. Maybe he gets traded. There was talk that he might have been traded in season. Maybe he gets injured and misses time, whatever, may have happened to him. But something that opens up the passing game a little bit more. Obviously, a lot wrong with the Raiders passing game this year, from Josh McDaniels struggling and then being fired, Jimmy Garoppolo being benched. There's been a lot of problems there, but particularly how concentrated the targets have been at the top. I think the scenarios where Mayer worked out would have probably required Davante Adams to have not been this target dominant number one. And, I think the way that the Cardinals season went is sort of a blueprint, and they don't have a Davante Adams, but McBride's gotten into a role where now he just looks like he's the number one. He looks like the Travis Kelce of the Arizona Cardinals passing game now, where like Marquise Brown and everyone else is just a secondary piece. Trey McBride's their dude. They're not perfect apples for apples scenarios, the Cardinals and the Raiders, but I just wanted to point to those subtle differences in those late round tight end profiles and the ones that hit and didn't hit, and why you do still have to be willing to cast a little bit of a wide net and not try to predict too much which of the profiles are going to, it's not simply that Sam Laporta was getting the snaps early that tell the whole story. There's a lot more in his profile, and we had to pay a higher cost, with him getting the snaps early. And he's not the first, young tight end to get early work. I mean, Dalton Kincaid has gotten a lot of work early this year as well, and he's been good, but he has not been Sam Laporta. And so there are layers with these things. I just wanted to, make a point about not drawing the wrong conclusion.
And I think that goes back to this idea of accurately self-evaluating. Because I think that one of the most difficult things to navigate is training camp buzz. And I say difficult to navigate, and it's not just during draft season and during training camp, but it's after the fact. Right? And that may sound stranger, but when you look at yourself, one of the things that you want to think about a little bit and know, at least to an extent, is, are you the type of person who really focuses on and remembers your mistakes? Or are you the type of person who really focuses on and remembers your victories? Not that one of those is better than the other, but it is going to play a role in how you self-evaluate if you're trying to be accurate, because you're going to need to counterbalance some of those things in terms of how you think about what's likely to happen, right? And so when we look at training camp types of buzz and training camp types of success, one of the things that you mentioned right there is the price and the fact that everybody else knows about the buzz as well. And so a lot of the buzz is going to be factored into the price, and then a lot of the buzz is going to be inaccurate. And so I think that if you're someone who tends to focus on your misses, then it's really easy to look at someone who was buzzy and hit that you didn't draft and tell yourself, okay, one of the things that I want to do next year is be more aware of, or not even necessarily more aware of, but target these guys who were buzzy in training camp, and to make sure I don't miss out on that. And that's not necessarily a bad take. There may be some situations where you want to do that. But when we're looking at how we can exploit ADP and beat drafts as opposed to simply follow along with drafts, there is going to be a value to remembering the times where you faded the buzz and got it right and got a great price because you were focusing on the analysis and the evidence and the logic of the situation and tried to not get caught up in that buzz. You got a player at a round to a 2-round, or maybe if you're talking about a less proven player, maybe you got him like an 8 or 9 round value because you focused on the evidence. And so that can work either way, but it is, again, an important element where you have to understand yourself and what you're most likely to remember and be frustrated by. And that does go back to the Rashad Bateman element in a way, because I do think it's possible to look at him and say, with what Zay Flowers was already doing, I mean, there's just not room there. And you really just don't want any Rashad Bateman. And one of the reasons why I'm pretty frustrated with how much Rashad Bateman I have is that I didn't really like Rashad Bateman as a pick, and yet I kept taking him because of the wide range of outcomes, because of the prospect profile, because of the draft pedigree, and you throw out some of the injuries and you say he's still early enough that those things are relevant. And you're like, I'm getting a 3-round discount from Zay Flowers. So there's a good reason. You got to have to fight back in your mind a little bit on the obviousness of Zay Flowers being the good pick and Rashad Bateman being the bad pick. Because again, there are plenty of previous situations where 2 players who were exactly the same in terms of what they brought went the other way. And the fact that the most recent one is so heavily in favor of Flowers doesn't mean that you always want to do that. For me, I think in terms of evaluating that particular situation, I had more or less had it right, but didn't want to pay for Flowers. And then as a result, I let that compound with a bad play of going ahead and getting Rashad Bateman. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so frustrated with it. And yet at the same time, you do want to remember that it wasn't inevitable that two players with these types of profiles and these types of like buzz situations would have come out with the seasons that we did get from them.
Yeah, those are great points, Sean. Man, this has been a fun discussion. I'm excited to see where these teams go. We talked a little bit before the show about maybe doing a quick look at what our teams have going and what we're hoping for. The team we've been talking about quite a bit, and we haven't really talked about everyone who's on the team, but it's the wide receiver start that had the Kyle Pitts and everything else. It does have McBride, so we're playing Pitts this week. We've been riding McBride, but I had Amon-Ra and Waddle were the two wide receivers at the top. It's a Tua team. Still looking, and this is one that does have Puka Nacua as well, so still looking pretty strong. That one did get the automatic bid, but won last week, if I'm not mistaken, and will be playing for its league title. Then we have two others. No, excuse me, that team lost last week. Then we have two others that did not get the automatic bids, but won and are playing for league titles and then to get into the sprint. The one that lost was the one that we actually talked about on Sunday night at the end of our show. We were going up against Joe Mixon on Monday night. Joe Mixon decided to end that team's quest for the league title, but it is already into the sprint. So we have one advanced and then hopefully two more this week.
We do. And the one that we're tracking probably the most closely because it appears to have, I mean, Ben, I'm an optimist. So I'm sure some people will be like, no, you still need more firepower. But I think that it's unique enough and has enough upside to win the $1 million. It has to win this week. It is favored, but this is the Sam Howell bye. So you've got to go to your QB2. Then before the season, we would have been very excited to deploy a Geno Smith who has DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. It's a little bit more nerve-wracking to play him now in the league finals at the San Francisco 49ers. You're probably going to get plenty of chase action, but you would like for Geno to look more similar to what he looked like against the Cowboys, where it's a high-scoring affair from the beginning and competitive, as opposed to merely having a full game worth of garbage time. We know that sometimes those can go well, but sometimes your team just continues to melt down throughout. But this is a fun team where we did lean into the running backs, and we have Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Javonte Williams, who's interesting because his usage has been encouraging. His scoring has been terrible. Ben, I believe that he currently has 4 fewer rushing touchdowns than Deebo Samuel.
Yeah, Javonte Williams has 0 rushing touchdowns. So whatever number Deebo Samuel has, it's that many more.
But it also has Devon Achane. And so we've gotten him back, and now the key is to get him across and to get him in. The receivers we need to do that are, again, Jalen Waddle. So you think about the things you did right, the things you did wrong. I would pick Jalen Waddle another 1,000 times out of 1,000, given that exact same situation. I do feel like he has been bizarrely and unfathomably terrible. This, for me, is like a healthy, 2 or 3% outcome for Jalen Waddle. If you told me that he was only going to have nagging injuries, and with Jalen Waddle, you always have those, but he was going to be more or less healthy, and that Tyreek Hill was going to be wide open on every play, and Jalen Waddle was not ever going to beat coverage, and when he did, he was going to drop the pass. I'd be like, yeah, we've seen some of that, but every time? You're telling me every time in every game? Then it's been every time in every game. Maybe he comes through down the stretch here, and then this is a Puka team, so you have that element with you. You know there are going to be plenty of Puka teams in, but if you can get your Puka team in and have this interesting other group of players, but also Sam Laporta. So, Ben, this is a team that has the different positions covered. It has the superstars. It has the flex. It has the tight end. If this team loses and doesn't get in, number one, you're just sad you didn't win the league title, but this would be a heartbreaker. I absolutely love this team.
Yeah, just hearing you say the if, I haven't really coped with the fact that this team might not get in. I've already written it in my mind that it's going through. From a draft structure perspective, I just want to mention very similar as well. We did take McCaffrey at the 105 in this one, and this was a late draft where Cooper Kupp had already fallen. He was actually the 203. I think this was right after his, re-injury, but this was that last week. So McCaffrey at 5 was kind of a nice run out. You had Jefferson, Chase, Kelsey, Tyreek Hill 1 through 4, and we
all of which
McCaffrey.
are good picks. Even knowing what you know now, you can easily make a defense for those picks.
Yeah, and then we went receiver after that. So we went Waddle and then T. Higgins as well, who is just like you didn't even really mention. He's on our bench now and has been for a while. And then we went to Breece Hall, Kyle Pitts, Javonte Williams in the 4, 5, 6 range, and then back to receiver, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and 2 more names that we mentioned from our other draft, Traylon Burks and Quentin Johnston, but Sam Laporta again. And you talked about this early on in this episode where, if Laporta gets hurt or busts, we lose that on every single team. But also, if you're just taking a really wide portfolio and Laporta hits, you better hope that the Laporta team has all the right pieces. What happened this year for us is we were very strong in certain directions. The Burks and the Quentin Johnson type picks did not work out, but they didn't kill us. The Laporta pick did and was so good that it actually helped. I mean, it was favorable to be as similar in some of our builds as we were. As you mentioned, Achane came next in the 11th round. And so we wind up not even playing Higgins, not playing those other receivers. It's a team that doesn't have a lot of receiver depth. You mentioned we added Nakua, and on FFPC, you can start as few as 2 receivers. We've been starting Waddle and Nakua and the 4 running backs. We're flexing both running backs. We have Laporta. We've talked a little bit about maybe if Javonte struggles, what ends up happening with him, that we do have some flex options. If JSN in particular, starts to really show something, he could squeeze in to the lineup. Certainly some other paths of upside really at all the different positions. I mean, we're going to be benching Kyle Pitts. We're going to be benching T. Higgins. I mean, there are paths at these different, and we're starting 4 running backs. So it's not like, if something were to happen to one of our running backs, we don't have the running back positions filled. We obviously do. So there are a lot of upside swings on our bench as well. This is a really, really fun team. And again, another one structurally, even though we went running back in the first, that looks very similar to the other drafts. We got the other anchor receivers. They didn't even necessarily work out, Waddle and T. Higgins. But the way that the whole structure came together with McCaffrey being the stud at the top, it does really work in a 2 receiver, 2 flex format. It's all kind of come together. Would love to get this team through.
We would. And the other thing to note there late, and something I think I would put very solidly in the things we did right column, is that we went Geno, Aaron Rodgers, Sam Howell, and this idea of there are going to be late QBs in 2023 who pan out and are huge for you, but you have to have the humility to say you don't know which one it's going to be. Sam Howell was our 3rd quarterback, and he was absolutely crucial to this team making the playoffs and now having a chance to make a run.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about Laporta at the beginning, Howell was coming to mind too, where you're like, yeah, I mean, all these teams that are really good have Laporta. I was like, yeah, they all have Sam Howell too. I mean, that was the other big thing. We didn't take a lot of early QBs. The early QBs have been good, but we talked, Sean, all off season about how, yeah, the early QBs probably are going to be good, but late round QB as a principle still works. It's just that there haven't been a lot of great late round QB seasons in the last couple of years, or at least it's certainly not in 2022. Howell's given you that this year, and there have been several others. I mean,
certainly
I know
he has CJ Stroud. It's interesting because some of the teams that I look at, I'm like, where is CJ Stroud? Where is his manager? And it'll be the team that has a Jalen Hurts or has one of those guys. And you're like, man, I'm so grateful for the fact that Stroud ended up as in a situation where he doesn't even actually add value.
Yeah.
And certainly there are plenty of other examples. I'm just, looking at a few crucial ones, but that
Brock Purdy was, I mean, we talked a lot about Desmond Ridder, Kenny Pickett, didn't necessarily pan out, but Brock Purdy's one I know that I had marked as a target in my rankings over at Stealing Signals. And he's another one that's been very good late. Another one that I saw some stuff about win rates and things at this stage, but Jordan Love has started to pop up as a plus win rate late round player. He's had enough good games. I think Russell Wilson as well, because of a high TD rate. There's been actually kind of a lot of late round quarterbacks that have been good this year.
Well, then that brings us to kind of our final team. And we share this one with your co-hosts and ship chasing, Pat and Pete. This team has Tua, Brock Purdy, and Jordan Love. So we have a decision to make for our Week 14 start. It's a team with McCaffrey, ETN, and then this one is interesting because, again, it has Sam Laporta, but the starting lineup at wide receiver and the flex a little bit weaker. So we really need this one to go on a run. I joked about all the teams having Jackson Smith and Jigba. He's a bench player virtually everywhere. He's not for this squad. As it happened, I was nervous that his drop touchdown last week was going to cost us the advance. It turned out that the rest of the guys scored so many points that it was not an issue. But this team is going with Waddle and Pickens and Nakua and JSN, in part, again, because this is another T. Higgins team, and he is on the bench with all of those things that have happened there. This is also a J.K. Dobbins team. So this is one of the Dobbins teams that actually did make it across. I look at this team and, just like you always do, even though it is a waste of time, you're like, what if it still had J.K. Dobbins there? It would be in much better shape. What are your thoughts on this one here? We did make the Tua pick, and we have kind of moved around some of the other guys. We actually drafted Kyler Murray and Trey McBride on this team, but they didn't make it through to this point.
Yeah, we had to shuffle a little bit with losing J.K. Dobbins early. We only drafted 4 running backs, and so we did some shuffling, I know, early in the season there. Deonta Foreman was the 4th. He's ended up being good, but if you remember back to the first few weeks, he wasn't even active, right? I mean, it was not looking great for Deonta Foreman. So we basically only had McCaffrey and ETN for a little bit of a stretch there. I think we just cut Foreman pretty quickly as well. I think what we did was target the running back position, but we also we didn't hit our receivers as well either. This is another Waddle Higgins, another Quentin Johnson, Treylon Burks.
Did those guys not have a good season?
No, they didn't. But it's funny, their advance rates look really good on our rosters, like you were saying earlier. And we went 4 tight ends on this as well, and so we knew we were going to pare down the tight end position. We wind up cutting McBride early. He was our 4th, a late round tight end that we would hope to have seen. You pointed out to me before the show, he only had 4 points per game through the first 5 weeks. I mean, it's really tough in certain builds.
His snap rate was really low.
It was not, there's just no way you could have held him through. That's the start of the buys you're talking about, week 5 and the J.K. Dobbins injury and things. There's no way you could have held them. But it is a bummer when you look back on it and you go, man, we did draft that player. This is a funny one because you look at it, there's not that many great picks necessarily. We did get McCaffrey at 106 and ETN in the 4th round and structural, and then Laporta in the 10th and Tua in the 11th, and structurally kind of addressed a lot of different things with redundancy. But like you said, we're now going to be starting JSN and trying to get through, banking on that late season upside and breakout. And last week would have been his breakout game if that TD counted. It would have been near 100 yards and a TD. It sort of was his breakout game anyway. It was a season high in targets, in receptions. Excited to be forced to play him. I think it's actually kind of a fun little story there.
And it's also been an interesting journey with this team because with about 3 weeks to go, it was in first place in both points and record. And then, just to be, very honest, it collapsed. So it fell out, and now we've got to win through to make it because it was not one of the top 2 seeds. It goes off again last week with 170, wins easily. Now we're into the finals, and now it's going to be that question of your guys that you bet on, can they come through for you at the big moment? That coordinator change for the Steelers, is that going to be any kind of catalyst for George Pickens? It hasn't really been yet. Can JSN do it in a tricky matchup with the 49ers? How big are McCaffrey and ETN going to be? Because one of the reasons the team was doing well, when McCaffrey and ETN were more or less the 2 best running backs, when you have both of them on the same team, then the team looks very, very good. When ETN starts to put together this more recent stretch where he's been bad, and that's when the team has collapsed along with not having the rest of that firepower. So it's been a fun journey. I'm interested to see what it does. Ben, do you have a big prediction for the listeners for tonight? How many points is George Pickens going to score? Can we get him in the end zone? The Patriots are not allowing this. If the Patriots have their way, they'll lose this game 3-0, which doesn't really accomplish our goals.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of faith in tonight's game. It's the lowest over under in however many years. I think it's like at 30. And I mean, I'm not going to make an official pick on this one over at Stealing Lines, but if I did, I would take the under, even though it's an absurdly low number. That's why I'm not making it an official pick, but I do think you have to expect with the way the Patriots are playing right now, they're essentially tanking. And then the fact that the Steelers are probably going to go a little more run heavy. They have Mitch Trubisky in there. I don't know. I mean, this is a lot of people are you're not going to be listening to this pod until Friday, and they're going to be like, man, it was 31-28. You sound like an idiot. But my prediction would be, 13-10 kind of a game, maybe not even 10. I'm thinking of the Steelers winning, but I mean, can the Patriots put up 10 points?
Well, Ben, that raises the question then. Your Washington Huskies, I think the current favorites to win the college football national championship. I get most of my college football information from you, and that's the rhetorical direction that you've been going here. Mm-hmm. Your Husky former star Jake Browning eviscerates the Jacksonville Jaguars on Monday Night Football. Should T. Higgins be in our lineup instead of George Pickens tonight?
Ooh. That's one to think about. The problem with Browning eviscerating the Jags was the 4.5 average throw depth, very shallow, not conducive to T. Higgins' production.
T. Higgins had 3 catches for 36 yards.
Yeah, in a 350-yard passing game. So not, I don't know. That's a good question. That's close. We'll have to talk about that.
So, well, that'll do it for the Thursday edition of Stealing Bananas. Ben, it's always so much fun to chat with you and get your takes on strategy and structure and certainly player evaluation. This is just, our first little brush with looking through the 2023 season. Obviously a key moment this week. But I have a lot of teams, as do most people, who are on that 2-3 line in BBM3, and you're hoping to get that team in as opposed to not. As I was going through, I saw that quite a few of those teams had Sam Howell and an injured quarterback. So that is not ideal. I think I have an HN team that's right there on the line, and my 3 quarterbacks were Trevor Lawrence, Kenny Pickett, and Sam Howell. We'll see if we get any QB points from that trifecta this week. I am betting on 0. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you follow him at Yards Per Gretch. Sign up for Stealing Signals. Sign up for Stealing Lines. Our question today was sparked by a discussion that he had in Stealing Signals Gold. You don't want to miss that. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz, the coupon code RVRadio2023 at checkout. Leave us a rating and review. That helps us with the algorithm. We love you guys. Dominate tonight. Dominate this weekend. We'll talk to you after week 14.